What if the sheriff cited government officials instead? It's July 22nd, 2026. Welcome to yes2hellwith.com. Imagine a quiet neighborhood. A retired man has lived in his home for some 30 years. Every evening he sits on his front porch with his wife. Sometimes they drink coffee, sometimes they drink iced tea. Tonight, he opens a beer and they watch the sunset together. But then a zoning administrator happens to drive by. He stops. He walks onto their property. He writes the man a citation. The reason? Drinking from an open beer container on his front porch. Public consumption of alcohol visible from the street. The homeowner asks, "What law have I broken?" The official answers, "You have violated the ordinance." The man pays no attention to the ordinance. Instead, he goes to the sheriff. He walks into the sheriff's office and calmly says, "Sheriff, I believe the government has violated my freedom." The sheriff listens. He doesn't begin with the ordinance. He begins with questions. What happened? Were you threatening anyone? Were you intoxicated? Were you disturbing the peace? Were you damaging anyone else's property? Were you violating anyone else's liberty? The sheriff nods when he hears all negative answers. Then he asks one final question, perhaps to himself. Why did government become involved? So the sheriff investigates. He interviews the zoning administrator. He reviews the citation. He examines the facts. Then something extraordinary happens. Instead of concluding that the citizen violated the ordinance, the sheriff concludes that the zoning administrator violated the Constitution. Not intentionally, perhaps, not maliciously, but by exercising government authority beyond its constitutional limits. The sheriff walks back into the zoning office and he hands the zoning administrator a citation. Not for drinking, not for zoning, but for unlawful deprivation of a citizen's freedoms and natural rights. The sheriff says, "You entered a protected sphere of a peaceful citizen. You exercised government authority where no one's life, liberty, or property had been harmed. You burdened freedom without constitutional necessity. Today, you will answer to that charge." So think about that. For the first time, the citizen isn't the one being questioned. Government is. For generations, we've been accustomed to one direction. Government questions, citizens answer. Government accuses, citizens defend. Government cites, citizens comply. But constitutional government works differently. Government must answer for every exercise of power that is limited and beyond the government's means to enforce. Now imagine the ripple effect. Every zoning administrator in the county suddenly realizes something is different. Every code enforcement officer realizes the same thing. Every health inspector, every licensing official, every bureaucrat and public employee, before they interfere with peaceful life, they had better ask themselves one question. Do I actually possess constitutional authority to do this? Because if they do not, they may be the one receiving the next citation. This isn't about punishing public officials. It's about restoring constitutional accountability. Government officials are not enemies, they're public servants. But public servants must answer to the Constitution just as surely as they expect citizens to answer to the law. The Constitution limits government, not the people. Now expand this beyond the front porch and the drinking of a beer. Now expand this beyond the front porch. A family is ordered to remove their vegetable garden and the sheriff investigates. The code officer receives the constitutional citation. The widow is fined for selling tomatoes in front of her house. The sheriff investigates. The enforcement officer answers for his conduct. A father is cited for fishing in order to feed his family. The sheriff investigates again. The game warden must justify why government entered that peaceful activity. Now notice the pattern. Government no longer begins with regulations. Government begins with constitutional justification. Some people will say that creates conflict. No, it does not. The conflict already existed, but it was never expressed appropriately. The citizen simply hadn't had anyone willing to defend him. Others will say that will create chaos. No, it won't. It creates, listen to this, accountability. If government officials know they must answer for exceeding constitutional authority, they will become more careful, more restrained, more discerning, exactly as the Constitution intended. The office of sheriff was never meant to be merely another enforcement office. It was intended to be the constitutional guardian of the people's rights and freedoms because it limits government. The office of sheriff exists to ensure that government remains within its proper boundaries, not to expand those boundaries, not to defend every ordinance, not to protect every regulation, but to protect natural rights and freedom itself. Imagine living in a county where every public official understood that before burdening a peaceful citizen, they might themselves have to answer to constitutional questions and excessive use of power. How many unnecessary citations would never be written? How many needless regulations would quietly disappear? How much freedom would simply return? Not because government became weaker, but because government became streamlined in a very constitutional sense. Perhaps that is what constitutional restoration really looks like. Not government endlessly citing the citizen for infractions, but government officials being held personally and professionally accountable whenever they exceed their constitutional authority. When that day comes, the Constitution will no longer be words on paper. It will once again become a restraint upon power, and the people will once again live as free men and women. And as always, may truth reign supreme.